This is Kenya's biggest conversation, The Situation Room. Eric Ndu CT, our guest host today, RAMAH NYANG, and our guest for these 2 hours, John Kinuthia, Senior Programs Officer, International Budget Partnerships, Kenya. CT, why don't you please remind us today's proverb?
No one can prepare for the Harmattan by drinking plenty of water.
No one can prepare for the Harmattan by drinking plenty of water.
You can try though.
You could. You could.
You'll be given marks for effort.
I mean, you won't even have that water because it's going to be rationed twice a week.
RAMAH, what's your interpretation of that proverb?
appropriate solutions to appropriate problems. Please link the two together. You cannot try and tax yourself into prosperity. It doesn't work that way. You just can't.
Really?
No.
Well, neither can you talk your way into prosperity.
Well, there's that too. But someone's flying around a lot and trying to talk our way into alleged prosperity. Doesn't quite work.
Yeah, it's working for some though.
Well, I mean, if you're wearing a Ferragamo watch, yes.
What? Who is Faragamo?
This watch,
Who's this guy?
I mean, I keep hearing this.
Sounds like it's a devil.
Yeah, but
Like
no,
if,
I mean,
if you have
I've heard
Ferragamo,
people
my
ma-
God.
What's wrong with this guy?
It's a very expensive.
It's very
designer
niche.
watch.
Very
They sell
bourgeois.
those things
See, Kambai. This is relatively cheap in comparison.
relatively.
Yeah,
It's
relatively.
luxury.
Somebody has gone and bought it, isn't it?
Yes.
It belongs to them. It's a good thing, isn't it?
part of prosperity.
Wait. If you're on the public payroll, my friend. No.
If you're on public payroll, you're not buying Ferragamo watch.
Why not?
If you're on the
What do you
public
mean?
payroll
Maybe you
and
do.
we are paying you less than your take home should be less than $7,000 a month, and you're buying a Ferragamo watch.
You need to understand that what we pay our public servants
It's not what they earn.
is opportunity. So please stop complaining.
As a taxpayer,
Who's Ferragamo?
I have complaints.
RAMAH, did you not hear me talking about the plan just now?
Look, unless
If
the plan,
this guy had the plan 15 years ago
To buy a Ferragamo
to buy a
watch.
Ferragamo watch,
And he's got
this
one
year.
now. He wasn't always a cabinet secretary or a
It's
high
a journey that
official.
began a long time ago. Started investing.
Okay.
it's you know
And
it's,
ideas.
it's you know remember to go back to CT's points, solutions to problems.
Link them.
Please. So you cannot simply say that you had a plan to buy something 10 years ago, and that supposedly points to your competence. But we look at other parts of your work, and
No, Rama-
we are not seeing any
Rama
competence
does
there.
have a point. Faragamo has a problem. They're selling a watch. Solution, buy it. Yes.
We've moved the problem to Ferragamo.
Anyway, so if the plan involves buying shares in Ferrari and YSL and a slice of BlackRock, a slice of Apple, by all means, tuendelee.
Okay. So we are talking about managing our finances. And I said the buzzword now in government circles and even outside in your circles, John, is fiscal consolidation. What does that mean?
Fiscal consolidation is a term that basically means we need to reduce the gap between what we want to spend money on and how much money we have. Very basic means then you need to rationalize or kind of be more humble on
Live
what you
within
want
your
to
means.
live within your means, but at the same time you need to work harder to generate more revenue. So fiscal consolidation is not either or. I think sometimes that has been the challenge, especially when you look at kind of the public debate around it, right? A lot of it has really been focused on this. We need to mobilize more taxes. And especially when you listen to, to comments from government, there's a lot of talk of we need to collect more, Kenyans are undertaxed. All that is one portion of the conversation around fiscal consolidation. But the other side of it is you need to keep your expenditure within certain limits. Now, I need to put a caveat here, though, because one of the discussions that you often hear is we just need to cut, we need to balance the budget is often the language.
Hard fiscal rules.
Hard fiscal rules, zero budgeting, which basically means we ask what you're doing this year and we only give you a shilling for that year. But there are studies that have been done around the world that show as much as you can reduce expenditure, there's a certain point you get to where now it hits your economy, because government, especially in countries like Kenya, is a huge part of the GDP growth and the productivity of the economy. So fiscal consolidation is supposed to be this very nice mix of working hard to collect more, so generate more in your economy. What we were just discussing before in the past hour on how do you grow your exports, how do you make sure there's more activity in the economy that you can tax. But on the other side, how do you reduce, again, the discussion we're having on your approach to development? How do you take an approach to development that means you have a more humble approach to what things you need to spend money on?
And yes. that discussion is actually an interesting one, because it's something we discussed in October. When I was speaking to the finance minister in Marrakesh, one of the things that I asked him was, and this was fairly early on in the 2023 Finance Act, and my question at the time was, do you think that with the tax hikes that you imposed at the time, do you think you went too far? And his answer at the time was a very emphatic no. As far as he was concerned, the effects that we're seeing at the time, the decline in fuel consumption, etc., his argument was, no, these are macro issues, right? Fuel prices have been high around the world, and as far as we are concerned as a finance ministry, we're seeing similar things happening in other parts of the world. Therefore, this is not, the cause here is not the tax policies we have imposed. The cause is something else. But you also posed an interesting question towards the end of it, and it's been an ongoing debate that they're struggling with, and the IMF as well has faced a lot of opprobrium for it. His argument was this: when he left as central bank governor, our tax to GDP ratio is closer to 20%.
About 18.
Right? Yeah, around 18.
Just above 18, yes.
Yeah, around 18%. He comes back as finance minister and he says our tax to GDP ratio is 13 and some change. It's under 14%. So essentially it's dropped, right, by around 400 basis points, even though the economy has been growing. And his argument is, why has that happened? Either A, our tax collection has not been as efficient as it should be, or compliance has fallen off, which is the argument that we also have been hearing the last week from Dr. Chris Kipto when he was doing his presentation to legislators. Or B, to go back to CT's argument a little earlier, we've rebased. You've expanded your economy. You've expanded your output. Because if you look at the way GDP is calculated, essentially it's looking at what is government spending, minus imports, exports, etc. But some of these things are not necessarily taxable, right, items. You've spent on a road. Brilliant. You spent, say, 1 billion shillings constructing the Eastern Bypass over X period of time.
Yeah.
Once the construction is done, yes, that will contribute to your GDP, but in terms of your tax yield,
Not yet.
It's not essentially going to reflect that, because, okay, fine, you had your one-off hit from importation of materials, a company came in as a contractor that hired some individuals, but once those jobs are gone, then what?
Then what?
Right? So you've grown output, but how much of this output can you actually tax? What's your effective tax yield? And that's one of the challenges that we're facing now.
And remember, fiscal consolidation is not a new term. I've been working in the space for just over 10 years. Every single budget document I've read in that period has had the phrase fiscal consolidation. So it has always been an ambition of the country that we'll get into a place where our deficit is more manageable. Remember, as part of the East African community, we actually have a target as a region that all our deficits will be somewhere 3.5% of GDP. So that's the true north for the region on where we want to be, because we feel that is more manageable as a deficit. So you're not borrowing too much. But there are reasons why it's not always worked, right? One of it, which is related to how we set our revenue targets. We're always very ambitious, right? So we always say we will collect more. I remember 2 years ago, I'm in a SACCO, like every Kenyan, or like many Kenyans. And when they were presenting the financials for the next year, the chair of our board of directors showed a number that was going to be about 30% increase in the revenue for the SACCO. And being the good budget guy I am, I stood up and said, that's unrealistic. And the chair of the board, in the answering the question, said, you see, we have a new strategic plan. And this strategic plan,
it's a 5-year plan.
Yes.
this thing, 30% we will hit. Do you know how much it grew by in the next year? Just 12%. We never even go to the half mark, right? And that has been the challenge for government, right? There's always this ambition. There's always this next big thing that we feel will help us collect more revenue. So we set the very high revenue targets. The current BPS that we were just discussing has a target of growing our revenue by 15% between 2024 and 2024,
For that to
2025.
happen, we need to spend the money, isn't it?
Well, so the goal is to spend money, right?
To
So
spend money, we need to borrow, isn't it?
yes,
Well, not necessarily
in
not
that sense.
Not necessarily spend money. And here's one counter argument you could actually make. 2008, Amos Kimonya comes to the floor of the House and he says, look, the global economy is a bit of a mess. We've just come off this absolutely atrocious period in Kenyan history. We need to create employment. We need to expand opportunities for people. And I don't know if he's ever actually spoken about this in public, in reflecting on the effect of that one line. It's literally one paragraph in that budget speech where he says, I propose that we reduce taxes on small displacement motorcycles below 250 cc's. If that decision was not made, you can literally draw a straight line between the approval of that tax cut and the surge that we have today in the expansion of not just the border industry, but deliveries, etc. Yes, it's come with its own negative externalities. I don't exactly enjoy. No one enjoys riding into traffic when you've got some guy who's riding into you.
Yeah.
There are all those problems. But generally speaking, that one single tax cut has provided immense value since then. So it doesn't always have to be a case of we need to spend money as government, as a society, to then produce positive outcomes.
True. You can choose to forego some revenue line, but then the impact will be longer.
It's
and
gigantic.
long-term.
But the same thing with the road and the infrastructure you're speaking of, yes. The whole point and the argument that economists make about infrastructure is what it's supposed to spur on. You give an example of the Eastern Bypass. I could give the example of the Thika Road. See? Yes, there's the one-off. They're the employees. But because of that road, things that ordinarily would not be able to take place, people would put up buildings, businesses would grow. Now, these you can tax. So at some level, it does spur growth.
Yes, and that's the argument, is the fact that and it's the reason why you have things like the Vision 2030, right? So you're looking more long term.
Yep.
And then you break that up into smaller pieces with the medium term plans. It's basically to try and connect the lines, right? Because you're not just planning for 1 year, right? Even within our budgeting space, we use what we call the medium term expenditure framework, which is supposed to give us a bit of a longer term look at things. But that does not mean that you're immune from learning from history, which is you have to look at past performance and ask yourself, so if we are not doing 30% or 15% over the last 10 years, what makes us think that we can do 15% in the next year, right? So there has to be sound justifications for why you are arriving at certain conclusions about how much you will grow revenue, or how much you think you will be able to to generate some active part of the economy to add to what you already have.
Yeah. And
the challenge for Kenya,
and actually illustrates John's point. The fact is that our tax revenue targets are just, calling them disconnected from economic reality is being quite generous.
It's magic thinking.
Well, that's one way of putting it. If you actually just look at the data, and this is not me pulling it out of thin air. This is
National
actually
Treasury's data.
This is from National Treasury. The target for tax revenue for the first half of this fiscal year that we're in now was 1.4 trillion shillings.
June to December.
Yes. Now, John and I have been in this space for quite a while, but he sees more data than I have. I don't think I can remember a single instance where every single tax revenue line was a miss. Normally it would be one specific one, it's one or two but as of the first half of this fiscal year, every single one was way off target. Import duty, excise, income tax, and that combines both corporate income tax and personal income tax, the lot. And income tax actually was probably the second biggest. No, it was the biggest one actually. It had the biggest miss.
What was the target?
The target was to raise 596 billion shillings. by the end of the year. We missed that by 105 billion.
Okay.
Now, you've increased, and remember, please note, in June, what were we being told? Oh, we've expanded tax bands. We've added a 32% one. We've added a 35% one. We're going to tighten compliance. Or you Kenyans are not complying. You're not paying taxes. So even the argument that Dr. Kipto was making about, oh, Kenyans are not overtaxed, you just need to be more patriotic. You look at reality and you ask yourself, hang on, FKE essentially told us that this economy lost 70,000 jobs in the year to October. And 70,000 is roughly the amount that we tend to create in prior
informal jobs.
Yeah, in formal sector, right? Formal sector jobs in prior years. That's like eliminating all the jobs that were created in 2021. Now, that's not a patriotism problem. That's a structural problem. The tax targets that you have are simply not realistic.
How do they arrive at these tax targets, John?
There's a model. That's the answer we've always received from the National Treasury. There's a model. So there's a model.
Who came up with this model?
I think it borrows heavily from the IMF.
The model is not
actually.
human, eh?
It's not like a model.
No, there are certain things you
Follow
plug
your
in.
runway.
And in all fairness to all the technocrats at the National Treasury, because I've seen a couple of those Excel sheets, there is really an effort to actually really gauge how much the government can actually raise from the economy. Remember, Kenya is not Nigeria, right? We don't have oil, we don't have natural resources to speak of.
Thankfully.
Maybe if we had, we wouldn't be fighting too much about taxes.
We do have oil.
Thankfully, none of it is
fair
commercially
enough.
viable.
Yes.
So you don't have, so tax is our oil, right? So that's
You put it well.
so that's our natural resource, right? So that's what everybody is focused on. So getting it right when you're targeting it is important. So the technocrats at the National Treasury, and I always give them credit for this, they actually have ways to clearly tell what is it that we can collect realistically. But it's also important for us to always remember our budgets are prepared by technocrats and approved by politicians.
Okay.
And that's where the expenditure side of the budget comes in. Because you have the plan, right? The plan has certain promises it's trying to go for. You have the big four in the last government. It's something that the government was going for. So you are trying to fit your expenditure into a certain portion of revenue that always don't add up. And, when you look at what happens, especially even after we approve the budget, so we know the deficit. So like this year, the target for not the target. I don't think you have a target for the deficit. The deficit for the coming financial year is 750 something billion shillings. But what we've seen over the years is that every time we start implementing the budget, now picking the numbers that Rama just shared, then there's a realization, we might not collect all the revenue that we thought we would. So what do? We bring in a supplementary budget, we make an adjustment to the revenue. Often, the target is dropped. Then we go on the expenditure side. By some miracle, that always goes up. So your deficit actually expands over time. In fact, I have some numbers in front of me. We've kept like 10 years of tracking
Just the deficit.
And of those 10 years, this is from 2014, 2015, up to 2023, 2024. Only 2 of those years did the deficit actually contract during the period of implementation through all these supplementaries that we do. In all the other years, the deficit always goes up because we adjust our revenue downwards. We are trying to be more realistic, but we never seem to get realistic on the expenditure side. Why? Because
it stays high.
Because there are certain things we need to do. And we just don't seem to want to respond.
And not just that. I mean, it's also an operational culture issue. There's an article in The Nation today where they're asking, and the headline actually just sums up the story. Austerity? ? Rigathi Gachagua splurges 10 million bob on curtains.
But what?
Curtains. Curtains are, curtains, yeah.
So if you're in a situation where government is telling you, hey, tighten your belts, give us more money, give us more money, give us more money, but they're essentially splurging more and more cash.
What's this disconnect? Because there's a disconnect.
Yeah, and if I can just jump onto that a little bit, because we have these conversations and we're talking about the economy and we're talking about fiscal responsibility and consolidation and all of these things. Now we're talking about budget because we also know that the budget starts well before the CS stands on the steps and says, here's the briefcase, blah, blah. The process starts long time before that. And the technocrats that you speak of are actually crunching the numbers. They're coming up with these and how it's going to look like. Please stop me if I'm wrong, but it's not possible for the budget of a nation to happen in isolation. That there are other things that need to come into play. When we talk about this management of structure, when we talk about the necessity to be responsible when it comes to expenditure, when it talks about when you look at the revenue that you will bring in, revenue then has a direct impact on the budget that you will make in terms of then where you will put this money. That yes, loans and credit is accounted for when you come up with your budget, because you say, okay, what we can tax is not enough to cover this budget. So all of these things touch on each other. It doesn't. You can't have it just say, this is how much we have, this is what we're going to spend. And then at the same time, when you start to look for other ways in which you are going to actually bring in more revenue, what kind of simulation needs to take place to say that, yes, we have a budget, we have loans, we have expenditure, we have 1, 2, 3, so that these things can work in tandem.
I'm going to let John go on that one first before I come in with my working thesis.
So we have a budget process that is 2.5 years long. Our budget is not 1 year. That's just the implementation part of it. The reason why we have a budget process that is that long is because there's many multiple decisions, completely one dependent on the other, but that allows us to have the discussion we are having now, but even within the institutions of government. There's this dance between the executive and parliament, and we have all these independent offices. So kind of just coming to your point on the actors and what they are doing. So what that means is that even when we start the process, right at the beginning from August when the process kicks off, we are literally having a conversation of what is it that we need to do, how much money do we have, and then we keep refining it. Because like where we are now with the budget policy statement, the simple decision we are making, well, that might not be that simple, is just how much money do we give to each of our 10 sectors in the national government. That's it. At this point, we are not discussing what road, no, we're just thinking of at the sector level, how much money do we need to put into education, into agriculture, and why do we need to do that, right? Then that goes to Parliament. And Parliament is supposed to, ask the National Treasury, okay, so we see what you're proposing, please tell us why, right? So Parliament has a big role in this as well. And in that whole process, there's all this requirement for stakeholders to be brought on board. Right. IBP, where I work, we were in Parliament 2 days ago, literally on the budget policy statement, and Parliament was asking, what do you guys think about this thing, right? So all these actors that are playing a role in it. But the question is, at the end of the day, when the politicians are making that final decision of this is the approved budget, what do they take into account? Absolutely. Right? So do they take into account all these fundamentals that the technocrats in the National Treasuries are putting on the table? How do they balance it with Wananchi who are saying the road between my village in Timboro and Eldoret is not good? Right? And how do you balance it with the actual reality of we are in an economy where the national government, or as a country, we are spending 7 bob of 10 bob to repay debt. And all the demands on the political side, all the demands from the citizen side have to find space, but it has to be within that realistic ceiling. I feel that one of the places where most of these things fall off is in Parliament. Because the executive, as much as it has all the power to come up with a proposal, Parliament has a role to say, okay, fine, we see what you're saying. It makes sense. But the reality of the times does not come to that. And you see it in their report. So this is the amazing thing about Parliament. So whenever they put out, let me give a good example of the famous supplementary budgets. In 2020, Parliament sits and says this supplementary...
Sorry, John.
It's okay.
What is a supplementary budget?
A supplementary budget is a revised budget. It's not a new budget. So this is where sometimes we mess it up. A supplementary budget is not a new budget, because often when I see it reported, it's reported as the government has prepared a supplementary budget of 60 billion shillings. No. A supplementary budget is we approved a budget in June. Then 6 months down the line, the revenue is not revenuing. The expenditure has refused to expenditure. Oh, Kenyans killing English since 1963.
Telling you.
So we realize things are not working. So we come back to the budget and say, we need to make certain amendments so that the budget can be more realistic, so that we're not just doing a postmortem at the end. We can correct some things now for more efficient budget execution. That is the ideal use of the supplementary budget.
Okay.
That's not how it works.
Okay.
Often, other things, Kenya Airways is always the best example I use for this. Every time Kenya Airways has been in the budget, it's coming through the supplementary budget. So when you look at things like the supplementary budget as a good as a good case of what happens, 2020 Parliament sits and they are not happy about the supplementary budget. They feel Treasury is getting away with murder and they need to be put in check. So in their report, they say, number one, no supplementary budget will ever be brought to Parliament 2 months before the end of the financial year.
Yeah.
April 30th is the last time you can bring a supplementary budget here. This is in 2020 COVID year. And 2021, 2022, 2023, 2 supplementary budgets come every year. And the second one always comes 2 months
Towards the end
of the year. Some even come 2 weeks before the end of the financial year.
They come in May.
So I feel like we have a parliament that understands what needs to be done on the oversight side in keeping all these fundamental aspects of the budget working. But at the point when they need to take action, which was the same with the deficit last year, I hope I'm getting the years correct. Last year, in their report, they say we are keeping the ceiling of the deficit at 400 billion shillings. We will not approve anything above that. It's in their report, documented. You can read it and you're like, this guys on the BPS report, they say 400 billion shillings is the limit.
It's the cap.
Right? Then February 28th comes, they approve the BPS, and the deficit is in the 700 billion shillings range. So
And they approved 400.
they said in
That's
the
what's in the
report,
report.
because remember the report is what is brought for discussion in the House. Right? And this report is prepared after you listen to all the committees, because it's prepared by the Budget and Appropriations Committee. So they've listened to all the committees, they put their report which they want to be adopted by the House.
And done the arithmetic.
Yes. So that disconnect for me is, first of all, the institutions that are supposed to put things in check have not really played their part, despite the fact that every indication shows they understand the problem. Secondly, there is a question of just how much coherence exists in government, especially when you're trying to keep track of, a bit of a discussion we were having over during the break on what money is going where and who is spending what, and do we actually have all that in one page, right? And it's been the Treasury's ever struggle to find one account where all the money goes, the famous single treasury account, is to be able to track everything from one place, right? So you sometimes look at budget documents that are coming from government institutions, and the numbers and the proclamations in them are literally conflicting, right? So there's quite a lot that you see that tells you, okay, maybe at the point of our fiscal policy, we need to take a step back and say, why is it that things are not working? Because we can't be saying fiscal consolidation for the last 10 years, and that has not changed.
And we are still not achieving it.
We are not achieving it.
So how is it possible, or how should it be, if we can be prescriptive in terms of what needs to happen? Because obviously it's not been happening, that all of these different moving parts actually work together in the same vehicle, because it's not happening. We talk about the need to inject towards manufacturing, which will eventually go towards export, which is a direct investment to make sure your development index, you rise some points on development index. Doesn't really happen. So how can you ensure that all these parts are actually moving together, because they've not been?
Okay, you want to go fast? I go fast. Okay. So one of the things that we jokingly say as Kenyans is that we have the right policies. You know that joke? It's actually not a joke, it's true. This country has a lot of really good fundamental guidelines on how things should be done. And we even improved on it when we passed the new constitution, right? How things are supposed to work, including the whole element of decentralization, right? So there was a goal for it. We needed more parts of the country also to develop, because that helps the whole ship move in the right in the right direction. So I think, when you speak about the fundamentals in terms of how things should work, we have a lot of that in place. So I'm always one of those people who, whenever somebody says, we need a new law for this, I'm like, we actually don't. We have a lot of these things in place. The question is just how we actualize them. And how we actualize them has to start with, number one, there has to be some level of appreciation within the government and the actors that play different roles in the government, that we are not where we were in 2014, 2012. The situation has changed significantly. The situation has changed in terms of the mix of the money that government has to provide services. The economy itself has also changed. So we need to adjust to the reality of the moment, right? So the reality of the moment is that, first of all, we are in a very constrained environment when it comes to discretion on what we can do. And it looks like what we first need to do is just steady the ship. So steadying the ship means you first of all want to get your debt right so that in future years you're not dealing with the same problem. So that one we have to first get out of the way. This domestic borrowing that is very expensive, how do we sort it out? Commercial loans that we keep going for, how do we sort that out? So there's that side of, we just need to get the funding reality correct, because right now the reality changed. The most dependable revenue sources for government, which is just what RAMAH was reading around the performance in the first half of the year. You can see what is happening in that space. That's our most dependable revenue source. Coming on the other side, you want to get to a point where the government also appreciates the fact that we cannot continue spending as though it's 2012, right?
You can't keep running a portion of a pro box budget.
Wow.
This guy has some things.
Serious nuggets.
From the big watch. Now the Pro Box was just chilling, and the Pro Box has been attacked.
We're doing very well.
The reality is that we are essentially working on a pro box budget, but we want to be running around pretending that we have, the
budget for a Porsche.
The latest generation of the Porsche Cayenne, and not just a diesel one, the turbo. It's parked in a nice garage somewhere in Runda. We don't have that kind of money.
So we need to get realistic on that side. And I think the government has made the commitment inward that there's going to be more austerity, there's going to be more, right? But that can't just be tampering with, as somebody said in an article last week, it's not just tampering with money for tea and mandazis and money for travel.
Always. Made a committee or spoken of a commitment?
Spoken of.
Spoken of.
Because ultimately it comes back down to the talk will be here. The execution
is
absolutely,
something
which would now lead me to another question here, because I think it plays directly, because we can talk up here, but the actual execution of some of these things, even that for which you budget, for example, and I think it's time for us to name these things as we see them, as often as we can, in order to bring about perhaps some semblance of what ought to happen. If you have a budget of 600 and so billion shillings, for example, that's supposed to go towards education in a year, the year 2023, 2024, and part of that money, for example, goes towards capitation, right? Come the end of the year 2023, you've paid out capitation less 37%. Less 37%. Where does this money go? The remaining money, you've budgeted for it. So budgeting to me, and please, gentlemen, stop me if I'm getting this wrong. Budgeting is not just we are going to put a number. Budgeting goes the entire process, meaning this is what we need, this is how we're going to spend it, this is where it's going to come from, isn't it? Yes. Or is there something?
Yeah,
that's correct.
Ideally, right. So you know where that money is going to come from, and you know the number of children in the country, even those ghost ones. You know the number of schools, you know, even the ghost ones you added, we know.
Plus the ghost teachers and the ghost schools.
Plus the ghost schools, plus the ghost teachers, all the ghosts, boom. You are aware.
Yeah.
So when you pay less 37, because it's all budgeting, when you pay overtime less 37, and then we start a new school year in January, and we just carry on as though nothing happened.
So this is
where does that 37%, which was budgeted, go? And then how can you say that you're going to go into, because we're already in the process, how do you then go, and education is in that thing?
The new budget.
Yes. How can you say you are budgeting authentically, with integrity, whereby the last budget you did not fulfill?
You didn't implement it.
You didn't.
Well, the short
you did
version-
execute.
The short answer is that it's a mix of two things. The short and crude answer is we're not budgeting with integrity, because part of it is a structural problem. So to go back to the structure that John pointed out, if you think about how money flows out by law out of the consolidated fund, what's our first obligation? pay debts.
Debts, yes.
Right? Pay our debts, pay our salaries, pay our pensions, etc. After we finished those things is when you can now then turn around and say, okay, with what has been left over, we now need to send money to these ministries. We need to send this cash to energy, this cash to defense, this cash to education, this money to agriculture, etc. All of those guys. Right? And then after you sort that out, then you turn around and say, okay, counties need to get X, equalization fund needs to get Y, and so on and so forth. Now, to begin with, remember the context that John was talking about. What have we done in the last decade? We've been on a crazy Fuliza-style binge as a country. We've borrowed money. It was cheap. It was available. You go into the market with the 2014, it's oversubscribed. You come back to the market with another Eurobond in 2018, it's oversubscribed. You're like, there's money. What are you talking about? Pesa utas, bwana. We will find it somewhere. The money is there. But eventually, all of these things are going to come back and bite us. I remember Robinson Jeru Gidai, when he was finance minister, because I think he was around when we issued our first Eurobond, right?
Was it not? It was Rotich, I think.
Rotich.
Was Rotich?
Was
2014.
It came after him.
Gidai
was
came,
Kibaki's
but he
time.
did because originally the plan was to issue it at the tail end
Of the Kibaki years.
of the Kibaki years before. But I remember one of his last speeches as finance minister. What he said was, one of the fastest growing expenditure item that we have at the moment is debt service, and this was better part of 10 years ago. So as far as back then, we knew
We could see.
we have a debt service problem, which then leads me conveniently into what you're talking about. If you have a situation where you have all of these baked in structural expenditures that you have to do first, there's a lot of spending that will essentially get kicked down the road. So you might have planned on paper to spend $5 billion or $600 billion, 500 billion shillings or however much, 500, 600 billion that we spend on education every year.
600 billion.
Right? But if you don't have the money to spend it because there are other priorities, that budget will not be executed as laid out in paper.
Okay.
Right? And then two, if you're a legislator, ideally what you should be asking yourself as the chair of the budget committee and the finance committee is, hang on a minute, all of these things that we agreed to last year, did they actually get implemented? No. Shouldn't we then recalibrate our budget for the next fiscal year? Ideally, that's what should happen. But the ability of our legislators to actually sit down and tell MPs, tell the executive, listen, last year we gave you 200 billion for XYZ. You did not spend it. Or we gave you 200 billion that was supposed to go into education, and then you turned around and decided, actually, no, we're going to spend this on defense instead. And there are instances where that has happened. So, for example, this was during the pandemic years. There was cash that was taken out from the Petroleum Development Fund, right? Which is supposed to essentially be able to turn around and pay oil marketing companies and, in the name of stabilization. It's a subsidy, let's call it what it is. Stabilizing fuel prices. And then they turned around and said, actually, no, we need to service SGR-related debts. No one in government has ever held to account for that diversion because technically it is illegal, right? And those are the sort of things that will consistently keep happening. So as long as you have an incentive structure that does not penalize the government for essentially breaking out of budgets, especially in a situation where they know they could have stuck to that budget, the sort of behavior will simply continue. And at the same time, there's something else that, and I've just pinned it at the top of my profile on Twitter. I'm still one of those old guys who will call it Twitter, not X. The IMF's Africa Department Director, Abe Selassie, to his credit, and I know the IMF is not everyone's most favorite institution at the moment, but the fact is, I don't think there's any other institution that could have backstop economies across Africa to the extent that they have. You look at the amount of money that they've essentially lent to Kenya, to Egypt, to Ghana, to Zambia. It's a colossal amount of cash, and realistically, no one else was going to stump it up. Last June, I moderated the conversation where he was there, James More, the CEO of Centum, was there, and we ended up having this exact same argument about, the IMF comes in and says, you guys need to raise your tax revenue. And Mori, as a business person, is like, from where? where's the productivity, right? Where's the employment? Where's the extra revenue that you guys keep saying you have to tax? And Abe's summary of what the problem was he says, look, there's a lot of African economies, Kenya included, are facing what he describes as a fiscal trilemma. Okay? So on one hand, you don't want spending to be cut. We all want spending on education to continue. Spending on education to continue, spending on healthcare to continue, spending on roads to continue, etc. But at the same time, we don't want debt to go up. Right?
Yep.
And at the same time,
you don't want to raise taxes.
You don't want to raise taxes. So
yep. And
we can choose.
The trilemma.
And to add to what you're saying, sometimes the money just never turns up. Right? Because we overestimated what we think we'll collect. Remember how public budgets work is slightly different from the household budget. We plan, then we go looking for the money. Right. In my household, we get money, sit with my wife, and we are like, things are elephant. This is what we will do with the money. In government, we prepare a budget. June 30th, we approve a budget. Then we go out to look for the money. So if we had a very ambitious target, like what we have this time round of 15%, and that money doesn't show up, then it will reflect as underspending in certain ministries and certain areas. Second area is the famous supplementary budget. So we approved 600 billion shillings for education. But within the year, we decided, no, there's a road we need to build. So we move some of the money from certain ministries. It's legal because supplementary budgets are part and parcel of our public finance architecture.
So whatever was supposed to happen, even if it's stalled, that is okay.
So you reallocate, basically.
No,
so you can reallocate.
As long as you get approval from MPs.
From Parliament. You have to go back to Parliament and get an approval for the budget you passed, we want to revise it. So that will reflect as underspending. So sometimes it's not where did the money go. The money never showed up. Or the cheese was moved, right, within the year.
But then, isn't this deliberate criminality? For example, explain to me why you'd pass a budget whose implementation begins on the 1st of July, but in September, you're already coming to Parliament with a supplementary budget.
This year was a special case because the shilling decided to do the thing quite
early. And
so our debt went bananas.
Okay.
You needed a higher allocation for debt service.
So we needed a higher allocation for debt because the debt was falling due month on month. So if you look at the first supplementary, the biggest chunk of adjustment was actually on the debt. It went up by quite some amount. The supplementary is supposed to be there to help you deal with unforeseen circumstances.
Like those.
It's not.
This one was foreseen.
So this time round, that was the explanation that came from the National Treasury on the shift. Because remember, all our external debt is in foreign currency, right? 67% of it in USD, 20-something% in euros. So any change in those markets basically affects our debt bill that we have to pay for the year. But if you look at what the Auditor General just released, I think 2 weeks ago, they did a report. Again, Parliament, to give them credit, asked the Auditor General and said, we think this supplementary thing is being misused. So please do an audit over the last 5 years and tell us where things are going off the rails, right? And it's because one of the things that we have in our law, which I think is the biggest loophole, is that it says that the National Treasury, or basically the executive, can spend on something that, like the example we are giving of education adjustment, but they have to come to Parliament and report it within 2 months. Which means what? They don't have to get the approval first to do it.
They'll come and inform
They
Parliament.
can do it and come and inform. And the figure that the auditor, I don't remember the exact figure, but the figure was in the hundreds of billions that was spent outside parliamentary approval by the national executive, by the national government. So in a sense, we have a scenario where supplementary budgets have become that nice place where you can make adjustments because there isn't as much rigor of public participation. And all of us like going and saying tunataka hii, tunataka hii, which happens when you're formulating the budget. But when you're implementing the budget, where the supplementaries stand up, there isn't as much rigor. And that has been the loophole. So as I said, to give Parliament credit, but then let's see what they do with the report, because that report has some really nice findings about how we can shift that whole supplementary environment.
Well, the fact that the same Parliament has not been taking action with the supplementaries, as far as the supplementaries are coming, and you're just sitting back, wait, these guys have been, what's been happening? Wait, can you give us a report on what's been happening? It's indicting Parliament And basically, that report is basically telling Parliament, you failed over the last 5 years in doing your job of checking and oversighting the implementation of the budget. Do you think Parliament will do anything and say, okay, by the way, we made a mistake. We're going we are from this time going forward, we will make sure that supplementary budget, if they've already said supplementary budget cannot come in May, it comes in May and they discuss it
and approve it
because they need to have their CDF released.
I'll go back to something I said when I was last year. UDA does not have the spine to stand up and say, Apana, we disagree with what Treasury is doing, we disagree with the policies coming out of State House, because they're not in the public interest in X, Y, Z. And it is unlikely that they will ever grow that spine until we have some serious crisis, an economic one, a social one to some extent. When that happens, maybe that might spur us to get to a point where we say, okay, Sawa, now we're changing behavior. But right now,
They sing to the tune.
Where's the incentive to change?
And you can see that when they meet with the party leader, like they did recently in Naivasha. And yes, they're saying all these things, but basically just being told, this is what we are saying, this is what we are doing. Can you go and implement it in Parliament and make sure that that happens? Well, John, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Come again. And again and again.
There'll always be budget conversations.
Oh, yes. John Kinuthia is a senior program officer at the International Budget Partnerships Kenya. He's been our guest for the last 2 hours. RAMAH NYANG is our guest host today. He's been here since 5 a.m. He stays on until 10:30 a.m. Eric Latif is the man in the chair, but I'm also leaving. We have a show on KTN News tonight from Kilifi. And this is on matters of climate and climate action and what's happening there. So I'll be moderating that conversation. I've got to leave because the helicopter is coming to pick me up. No, I have to find my way to Kilifi right now. So keep it here. The conversations continue.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.